Good morning, everybody. This is Andrew Plato, President of Anitian Enterprise Security. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a few minutes here. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. This is Communicating Risk to Executive Leadership, brought to you by Anitian and Allgress. We're going to wait probably about another minute or so because we got a lot of people joining right now. So if you just joined, hang tight for a minute and we'll get started in just a bit. If you just joined us, this is Communicating Risk to Executive Leadership. I'm Andrew Plato, President of Anitian Enterprise Security, and we're going to start in just 1 minute. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Again, this is Andrew Plato, President of Anitian Enterprise Security. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar this morning. This is Communicating Risk to Executive Leadership, brought to you by Anitian and Allgress. We're going to be recording this presentation as well, so that'll be made available online. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature of GoToWebinar, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. With that said, why don't we go ahead and get started. So our speakers today are myself and Chris Armstrong. Chris, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Chris Armstrong. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Allgress and multiple other organizations and Fortune 500s. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time dealing with is how to communicate the information security and IT risk issues to leadership teams in business terms in ways they can understand it.
And as you've already heard my voice, I'm Andrew Plato. I'm President and CEO of Anitian Enterprise Security. We are a 18-year-old information security consultancy. We are also the developers of a rapid risk assessment methodology called RiskNow. And we also spend quite a bit of time working with our clients to help them and business leaders to understand the nature and the value of business risk intelligence. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start off by talking about this concept of business risk intelligence and why that is so important to leadership and to your organization. After we establish that, we're going to step back and we're going to talk about why current risk assessment practices that organizations are using today and have existed for quite some time aren't working. What is the failure of those current practices? And from that, we're going to talk about what we need to do to fix those practices. And we're going to talk about some strategies to communicate business risk intelligence using using our rapid risk assessment approach and Allgress's tools and visualization technologies. With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump in, and we're going to talk about business risk intelligence. And Chris, I'm going to let you run with it from here.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So one of the reasons I start off with this slide is it's really interesting. This is from a movie, some of you may or may not recognize it, called Hackers, back in 1995. And what's really interesting about this movie, besides the fact that Penn and Teller did a cameo, or one of the gentlemen from Penn and Teller, is that the evil CISO in this, and the hackers were the protagonists in this movie, actually had to have a conversation with his CEO and the leadership team about this issue that they were having. And the amazing thing is, in 1995, he had the conversation that we all struggle to have. His discussion with the CEO was specifically addressing the risk to the organization, not the computer virus that was infecting the organization. So he talked about the fact that tankers were going to collapse, that there could be an ecological disaster, that the reputational and brand damage to the organization. He didn't have a conversation that was specific to technology risks. He didn't have a conversation about how to remove or quarantine a virus within the systems. His conversation was specifically directed to the relevant risk to the organization as it related to operational and reputational risk. These are the issues that they understand at the leadership level. We as professionals within the information security space tend to have trouble making that jump to having that conversation. What always struck me about this movie was that the person in our role had the correct conversation all the way back in 1995, yet we continue to struggle through to this day with having these leadership level business conversations without jargon. You can go on the next slide there, Andrew. So what is the challenge for us? We have all of these different issues that fit into our vision of risk. Business continuity, internal audit issues, firewalls, malware, all of these special challenges that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. They're part and parcel to how we live our world, but they are fairly meaningless to the people who we report to, who we are communicating risk issues to. We need to be able to translate these particular challenges as we see them into business terms and have a conversation that's meaningful and relevant to the contextual risk that is important to the information, to the people sitting in the audit committee and the board at our senior leadership level. Those are the issues that are important to them, not whether or not we have an intrusion prevention system that exists within our organization. It's not something that they truly care about. Go ahead, Andrew.
So what the big challenge here we see is that, businesses need more than big data. There's, this big data concept is everywhere. I mean, you can't walk around the RSA conference without tripping over piles of big data just about everywhere. Businesses need intelligence. They need to know what's going on. And if you put this in the context of, imagine a general who is, plotting an invasion of his enemy territory, right? He needs intelligence about his enemy, right? He needs to know what their forces are, what their capabilities are, where their weak spots are. But this general also needs to understand intelligence about his own army, about his own forces. He needs to know if his guys are ready to do this. He needs to understand, whether he has the material and the operational capabilities to do that. Intelligence, at the most generic sort of way, provides both a direction for an initiative and an understanding of those organizational capabilities. So again, in that general sort of analogy, it helps the general understand who do I attack and where do I attack them, but also, am I even able to attack them? So business risk intelligence is a concept that business leaders need. They're basically clamoring for this. And when we talk about business risk intelligence, what we're talking about really is this ability to bring together data into a common uniform sort of structure and communicate that back to the business, but communicating it back to them in a way that they get, that they understand. And as we're going to talk here in a little bit, that's one of the big problems with risk right now is people just don't get it. Business risk intelligence is also a decision-making tool. It is something that empowers leadership to make these strategic initiative kind of decisions, this ability to say, okay, I want to enter this new market, or I want to deploy this new software, or I want to do these business initiatives. Do I have the capabilities from a security risk perspective to even do those things, or are we so weak, or are there problems in the organization? And what we like to say is that this business risk intelligence, you need the mechanisms to be able to deliver that. And that's really what rapid risk assessment, which we're going to talk more about, and Allgress are able to do. They're able to synthesize and conceptualize, to use a couple of big words, business risk intelligence, and deliver those to executive management.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, Andrew, is that utilizing your metaphor earlier with the military, we have a common command language that not only do the troops understand, but the command crew understands as well. And so that way we're translating all these things that within the business risk intelligence concept into a conversation that everyone at the table understands.
Yes, and that is very critical. So let's step back now. We've come to this sort of point where we all kind of we all understand that businesses need to understand risk, but why don't they understand risk? This whole sort of rapid risk assessment process that I'm going to talk a little more about really got its genesis back a few years ago, and it started at Anitian, at least, with what we started to notice as a trend among our client base. We kind of kept hearing the same feedback from our own clients. And from other business leaders, things like, what does it all mean? Why is this taking so long? We conducted this big enterprise risk assessment. We really don't know what our problems are. What does it cost? Oh, this is just all some ridiculous PCI thing. It doesn't really mean anything. It's business leaders were constantly, and they still are, complaining about what they see as this disconnect between the techie side of the security teams and the IT department and their business, financial, organizational sort of needs. There's this gulf that's opened up, and that gulf is there for a couple of reasons. The current practices we have in risk assessment, as we like to say at Anitian, they dither in details and they blather in concepts. Which is a funny way to kind of think of. They spend a lot of time mired in details and talking about concepts, but they don't always really get to the point. These practices, they're too slow, they're too complicated, they're too incomprehensible to leadership. Leadership is reading reports and they just don't get it. There's a infamous incident here even at Anitian where we did a risk assessment for a customer many years ago, and we completed the report, and we were all done, and we're having the final wrap-up meeting with leadership. And the executive leader, he drops this report down on the table, and it's a big thump. It makes a big noise, and he says, "What does it all mean? There's a lot of data and stuff in here, but what's my problem? What do we need to do? How do we fix this?" Well, the problems he was having that a lot of leadership are having are there's a number of key sort of challenges. Number one is language. People just don't get it. They don't, leadership just doesn't understand what these reports are all about. And having a background as a technical writer, I can tell you that language not only affects somebody's ability to understand something, but also if they'll accept it. If you go into a room if you go into a room full of children or kindergartners and you start using all these big words like, conceptualize and theorize and everything like that, they're simply just going to roll their eyes and they're not going to accept it because they just don't understand. Business leadership, not to necessarily compare them to children, but the fact is they're not immersed in the language of risk assessments. As we like to say, the only people who really care about risk assessment language are risk assessors. And I have an example up here from Octave, which is a risk assessment methodology some of you may be familiar with. And I'm not necessarily going to read this. I won't put you through that pain. But if you do read it, it's like, a business leader who reads that, it's just not going to synthesize in his head because it's not something he or she is going to deal with. If leadership doesn't understand, they're not going to value what they're hearing. And that's just human nature.
No, I think that's a great point too, Andrew. And one of the things that's really important when you're communicating to business leaders is not just using the correct words, but also understanding the direction that they're trying to get. Your conversation has to be in context with what the organization is trying to achieve. So it's not just the words, as you're pointing out, but it's also making sure that the words are going in the direction that the leadership is trying to achieve. So if you're talking about X and they're only thinking about Y, your conversation is not in context to what they're trying to achieve. And that's a traditional issue we tend to face.
Yes, very much so. Next point I would make is that a big problem we see with a lot of risk assessments is this sort of this obsession with numbers and big mathematical formulas. I've seen risk assessments where there's just really complex mathematics and derivatives and such applied to compute odds and all this stuff. But the problem is that the majority of these equations begin with somebody going, that's about a 4, I think. And the challenge there is the minute you have some sort of subjective number in an equation, the entire equation becomes subjective. You cannot force an empiricism or an objectivity out of something that at its base, at its very foundations, is a subjective evaluation. The other challenge we have, and there's a couple of good articles about this exact problem, which is the inability to compute the value of IT assets. What is the value of an email or a storage array or a singular wireless access point? Of course, these things might have, sort of hard monetary values, but that doesn't really mean what they're truly worth. It's gotten almost impossible to compute a true value for anything. The real challenge we have here is that these numbers, they're meaningful. They feel empirical. They feel like they're valuable, but they're really not. They don't communicate much to leadership. If you go to your executive management and say, hey, we're a 5, well, I would say, is that good or bad? The 5 could be great. It could be, 5 out of 100 is horrible, right? What does that mean? Without some kind of context to that, I don't know what a 5 means. And neither is any business leader. And even if you give that kind of, we're on a 5, on a scale of 100. Okay, well, that seems awful. But what are the other 95 points to this? The other big challenge we see is that probability computations in a lot of risk assessments, they're not bounded. All probability has to be bounded by a time frame. Without it, it's meaningless. There's a great quote from Fight Club. On a long enough timeline, everybody's survival rate drops to 0. Well, that's true. If you look at the entire history of the entire universe, well, just about anything could happen. But that's not a very meaningful comparison, and it's definitely not very meaningful to executive leadership. They just can't digest these numbers.
Right, and just another point on that. I think that, Andrew, that's an excellent point. One of the things that I think we need to begin to achieve is how do we align the numbers that we feel are important with the business critical needs of the organization, and that's where that translation begins to work.
Absolutely. The other big challenge we have is that data in today's world simply just gets stale very quickly. 10 years ago, you could take a year to do a risk assessment because you weren't really going to change much in a year. Well, it's just not that way anymore. Risk assessments that are over 90 to 180 days old are frankly they don't mean anything anymore because the risk landscape is constantly changing. The big challenge we have with things like NIST and Octave and FAIR, which are risk assessment methodologies, is that they're great and they have lots of details and there's tons of material and blah, 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 but they're just too time consuming. If you actually did all the various pieces of NIST, it would take you years to complete an enterprise risk assessment. The other point I would make in all of this is that risk assessments is not some big group consensus. We're not all going to get together and feel our way to risk. It's not like, well, I feel like we're insecure. That's not risk assessment. Risk assessments are a singular point in time from a singular point of view. It's a person or group of skilled people, learned people saying, this is a threat. This is the vulnerabilities and the factors that mitigate that threat or don't mitigate that threat, and here's the risk. It's not let's all get into a room and hug ourselves to a risk assessment, okay? Although you're welcome to do that if you want. Last point I would make is that risk assessments, a lot of them today, simply just lack evidence. We like to say around here that lack of evidence proves nothing. It doesn't prove something. It actually proves nothing. And by that we mean actually nothing, like vacuum, empty space type, null set, nothing. And if you look at what a lot of the risk assessment processes and methodologies are today, they focus a lot on processes and worksheets and meetings and all this stuff, and there's no data behind it. There's no hard and fast data to support all that. The other challenge of that is that if you go and meet with business process owners, they'll withhold information from you. You like to use the example, if I sit down with database administrators and I say, tell me about your database, and oh, well, we take great care of it. I patch it every week. I'm on top of everything. Well, yeah, of course he's going to tell me that because his job's on the line. I can run a vulnerability scan or conduct a penetration test, and I can line up whether he's telling me the truth or not. If he tells me I patch it every week, and I run a scan and he hasn't patched it since 2007, I know he's not telling me the truth. I know that the threats of an attack against that database now are much more significant than what Mr. Database Administrator says. Testing and evidence can cut through conjecture and prove or disprove the severity of the threat. And Chris, you wanted to add something?
No, I was just going to say I've never heard of a database that's been that unpatched.
Yeah, exactly. And the last point I would add here is without testing, an analysis is entirely one-sided. Data is what supports the analysis and the assessment that's actually happening. Okay, so we know that risk assessment processes are broke. We know they're not working. We know they're not delivering business risk intelligence. So what is it that we need to do that? The key pieces to communicating business risk intelligence to leadership is that we need to accelerate this process. We need to make risk assessments faster. We need to get them done quicker, and they need to conceptualize the risk in ways that leaders get, they understand. They need to be able to look at charts and graphs and diagrams that can quickly present information and synthesize that in terms and language and concepts that a business leader understands. We need to integrate the perception of risk with the reality of the environment. That's what we were just talking about, the database guy, right? He's got a perception of what he thinks risk is, but there's a reality. And we need to bring those two together, and we need to bring them together in a common framework, in a single point, not a bunch of disparate spreadsheets all over, file servers and SharePoints and clouds and whatever. They all need to be in a single point at which we can communicate the nature of risk. We need to. One
of the things that I've always found, Andrew, is that when you're dealing with boards and senior leadership teams, spreadsheets and pivot tables, they question the integrity of the information because they can't decide where it came from, and it's difficult for us to show them.
Yes, that's a good point. And even though they might not always look at that evidence, the pen tests and the vulnerability scans, in fact, in many cases they probably won't, but if they know it's there and there is that evidence behind it, that's going to lend a lot more weight to the assessment that you're making. If you say you're a 5 and there's evidence to back up that 5 or 4 or 12 or whatever your number scheme is, or we're a high risk or a medium risk, the data can support that, and management is going to be a lot more confident in that assessment if there's data behind it. A couple last points I would make is that we also need to replace the theories and the blather of risk assessment with actionable intelligence, things that an organization can do, and they can do right now, and they get it and they understand it. Not some sort of generic ideal of what to do, but a real tangible action. And that's really what rapid risk assessment, we call risk now at Anitian, and Allgress are really capable of doing. So let me give you just the quick rundown on what rapid risk assessment is. And Chris is going to show you a little bit of how Allgress synthesizes this data. And then we're going to kind of wrap that up with how this all communicates to the management. But rapid risk assessment is Anitian's approach. We developed this. We basically took the NIST methodology and we squashed and crunched and chopped and sliced and we basically we thinned it down to a very simplified but very valuable framework of conducting a risk assessment. So we also took it and were able to unite both that hard and soft data, so both the traditional kind of interview the business process owners with security assessment data, vulnerability data, bring those two together. One of the key sort of inventions or proprietary parts of rapid risk assessment is this concept of a lens, this idea that we're not just going to look at risk. We're going to look at risk in a very particular way. So we're going to look at your business and we're going to say, not only just what's a risk or what is a threat, but how do we organize those threats? Typically the way we do this is through looking at the types of data your business handles. So for example, we'll say there's confidential data, there's regulatory data, there's security data. That is the lens by which we analyze the threats in your organization. That lens also simplifies how to conceptualize the data. When you talk to executive management and say, here are the threats that are relevant to our confidential data. Okay, I get that. That's not confusing. I'm a business leader. We have confidential data. There are threats. Got it. By using that lens, we can really quickly get their minds where we want them to be to understand what we're talking about. Rapid risk assessment is also going to leverage tools like Allgress, and I'm going to let Chris talk about that and what it is. And the last thing that rapid risk assessment does is it states risk as it is in decisive terms, backed with hard data. That's what a rapid risk assessment report looks like. And this is just one example of it. It's a threat, a simplified threat. We have a threat of malware infection. It's simplified vulnerabilities. Our antivirus is outdated. We don't have AV on a bunch of servers. We don't have AV at the network layer. Very simple. Not a lot, there's not a big long list of machines and, what DAT files are on which servers or which version of McAfee EPO we're stuck with or, what Symantec's trying to sell us or whatever. Simple, 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 simple. And then the recommendation. This is what we got to do. Let's not blather and talk and conjecture about malware. This is what we need to do to prevent and stop this problem. And then impact, probability, and risk, high, critical, high there, are very simple. I, as a business leader, can look at this report and I can say, okay, we have a malware problem. And this particular piece of data would be tied to some sort of lens point. So we'd say we have a malware infection threat against our confidential data. So now it's not just we have a malware infection problem, blah, 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 but it's threatening our confidential data, our customer data, our healthcare data, the data that we really, truly, genuinely care about. Now that's what a report looks like. I'm going to let Chris talk now about how Allgress kind of also can synthesize this data and present it.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. What's really interesting is all the things Andrew was just talking about are what tools like Allgress use to derive the posture assessment. That's really what we're talking about. So malware is great, but does that mean anything to leadership? No, it doesn't. But regulatory compliance, now it's something I'm concerned about. If I'm talking to my general counsel of my organization, I can have a business conversation about the regulatory or industry compliance impact, or even an overall security posture impact as it relates to third parties and contracts, and make them understand it. This is a very, very simple way to describe a posture, and the underlying data is all there. It's generated through the rapid risk assessment. It's generated through the vulnerability analysis and the ability to aggregate that information and look at it as a singular point, as opposed to looking at this spreadsheet over here and this vulnerability report over here, and then trying to aggregate that information and show the connections. When you're looking at it such as this, which we call our domain scoreboard, but is really a wheel chart, but a very simple, easy to understand concept. And I've had this conversation with general counsels before. It's very simple. Here's my posture. This is my compliance where I am right now. This is where I'm going to be. Very simple. And if I have to drill down, I can. I can drill right into the tool and pull up that specific malware representation that Andrew was just talking about and say, this is why I'm not meeting it, this particular compliance methodology right here. It's an easy, non-technical discussion, but it's based upon all that IT risk and information security risk data that they don't understand, but is extremely important to understanding the impact on their organization and potentially the impact on the things that, from a business line leadership point of view, they're trying to achieve. You can go to the next one, Andrew. We can also visualize the current state. Conversations have to be built in ways for each individual person you're talking to. So for instance, I was having a conversation with my general counsel in the last slide. Maybe I'm having a conversation with my CIO or my audit organization with this particular graphic. And what we're showing here is the domains of our program and where our progression is. Where are we going? How are we getting there? Where do we have trouble? What are the things that we're supposed to be doing that we're not? What are the thresholds as they exist in the organization? Do we meet our 10% threshold for compliance on a monthly basis? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But how do you describe that to people if you're trying to do it in spreadsheets and pivot tables? You don't. It's too difficult. By utilizing tools like Allgress, we're able to aggregate that information, interpret that data, and then display it in a meaningful way. And that's the power behind the Allgress tool. It's our ability to display information that is complex from an IT risk and an information security risk perspective in meaningful ways that is contextually relevant to the business leadership that we're having a discussion with. Again, this is a very simple way to show it, but the raw data that's behind it is very complex. It has vulnerability information. It has rapid risk assessment information. It may contain information from third-party audit representations or even your own security assessments throughout your organization. When you put something in an easy-to-understand format that can be taken out again later and used as a reference material and something to jog their memory on what the conversation was about, it becomes a very powerful tool. And you know that picture's worth 1,000 words type of conversation is very important when you have 15 minutes with your senior leadership team.
I would also add, Chris, to this that, you know, as a security consultant, this slide or this kind of chart really has a dual purpose. So, you know, you put this in front of senior leadership, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to communicate this risk very simply, just as Chris is telling you. It's going to help them conceptualize it in their heads. It's going to allow them to go into a boardroom and have a conversation, and really quickly they can say, we got an asset management problem, or, you know, hey, we're doing great on this compliance stuff. But it also accomplishes something else. It also shows progression. It shows that if you have two of these charts, say one from last year and one from this year, presumably there's more green this year. And that's great, because now you're not just communicating we have risk, but we're making progress on risk. And that, to executive leadership, is going to show value in the team, show value in the processes. It's going to reinforce that, okay, we made the right investments in compliance. We did we invested 50, 80,000 million, whatever, $100 in compliance last year. Hey, look at it, paid off. Great, we're doing great there, guys. Thumbs up, keep up the great work. So that's an added little benefit to this. You're not just getting them to understand risk, but you're also getting them to see where you're going. And that is sometimes equally as important.
No, that's a great point, Andrew. And you know, what's also really important, and you can actually see it somewhat in this slide, is the ability to identify where you're working with your key stakeholders throughout your organization. One of the things that information security organizations and IT organizations tend to have challenges with, showing the progression as it relates to key stakeholders, not just the general counsel and audit, but maybe HR. And in this way, we can actually show how we're moving the bar within those other organizations that have key data that actually impacts the business specifically outside of the technology realm. Remember, this isn't all about technology. It's about all the types of controls, whether they're technical controls or administrative controls. And the rapid risk assessment data doesn't just necessarily have technical controls in it, but can also show where you have information like unredacted Social Security numbers in filing cabinets and things like that. So it gives a broader picture of the organization and what it's trying to achieve. So, and then when we're looking at this from a holistic point of view, and we're saying, okay, my board, my senior leadership team, my CEO, what does this mean? How do we bring it all together and give a holistic perspective on information security and our risk posture as an organization? How do we do that? When you're using spreadsheets and tables, it's very difficult for people to understand exactly where the data is going. But if you can apply your critical data in a simple heat map format, but then apply context to that risk, then it becomes a powerful message. In this case, what we're saying is we're going to look at it from a revenue point of view. But if you're a hospital, it could be patient beds. If you're a credit card transaction company, it could be transactions by geographic region. However you want to bring that data in, whatever is important to you as an organization, not as an IT security or IT risk organization, but you as a business. What is it the business is trying to achieve? Do you run a hospital and so you take care of patients, or do you own 30 hospitals and so you're an organization that's in the business of running hospitals? It's different, and it can be looked at differently. And so being able to apply the raw risk information, but put it in business terms, in context to the risk of the people you're talking to. And again, in this case, maybe Austin's okay to be all the way up near the red and high-end yellow section there, because from a relevant point of view, most of my revenue comes from New York. If this was, patient beds, maybe I don't have any in Austin. Maybe it's just a storage locker, and that's okay. It can be sitting up there. This allows the business leadership to make risk decisions, to do their job in a way that they actually understand it, because we're communicating to them in a way that makes sense, that's relevant to the business, relevant to what they're trying to achieve. If you've ever been part of a Fortune publicly traded company and you've sat through the global risk assessment process, a lot of these organizations, to the point that Andrew was making earlier, it's kind of a finger in the wind test. What we are able to do is put a posture together that makes sense, and when your leadership takes that from the meeting with you, and an hour later is sitting down between themselves and can regurgitate what was said in their own words, because they have a template like this to leverage and say, okay, I understand where my decision points are, that's real power.
That is absolutely real power. And my addition to this would be a chart like this is awesome to put in front of leadership, because again, they can very quickly understand it. But what's more important is there is data behind these points. It isn't just it's about a 4. There's hard data behind this. There's vulnerability data. There's assessment data. There's rapid risk analysis going on. The leadership can know that they're not just getting some, I think we have a lot of problems, so let's go run out and buy a bunch of gear. They can see exactly where those problems are, and they can start making decisions about, okay, we need to invest in, this particular example, okay, I don't like where our Boston office is. We need to invest in this. We need to put resources toward this. This visualization, it's going to, it may sit at the top of this risk assessment effort in terms of what the leadership is going to see, but because there's data behind it, and we can show that data as well, and that data is coming from multiple sources, and we've aggregated it, and we've put it into a format that everybody can kind of agree to, there's going to be a lot more trust in that effort. It isn't going to be an effort that leadership is going to be inclined to say, well, that's just so-and-so's opinion. I disagree with you. I think we're just hunky-dory, so beat at you. We're not going to do anything. The data would prove otherwise. So.
Right, and I think, Andrew, that's a really great point. One of the things that we at Allgress always say is that the information needs to be repeatable, defensible, and consistent. And that's what tools based upon real data, like from the rapid risk assessment, deliver to a senior leadership team. And they can make actual real-world decisions that are relevant to them based upon business information without having to guess at it. And again, to Andrew's point, the integrity of the data when it's built like this is a lot harder to question than when you're looking at 34 pages of spreadsheet data and a couple pie graphs from a pivot table.
So I think our final point in all of this is really to understand what business risk intelligence is going to enable you to do. So looking beyond just risk assessments and understanding this concept of BRI, of delivering intelligence to your executives through tools like rapid risk assessment and Allgress's tools. This is going to empower leadership. It's going to help to give them a true understanding that, remember that analogy I used in the beginning, the general. It's not going to just help business leadership say, we want to go into this market or we want to invest in these new things, but it's also going to help them understand where they're at, what their capabilities are. It's going to allow this executive, this board that's sitting around a table, make a prioritization of investments rather than just running out and buying gear, which unfortunately a lot of companies are really fond of doing. They can start saying, let's not run out and buy gear. Let's figure out exactly what we need. Let's establish requirements. Let's do this in a much more controlled and rational process, which is another point I would make to all of this. We live in a world now of lots of threats, lots of sensational threats, of Chinese hackers, of malware, of advanced persistent threats, of people hacking, all this sort of black hat sensationalism of people hacking medical implants and et cetera. And it's really easy to get lost inside the emotionalism of risk and to get lost inside the latest, breach report and, all the statistics of, 96.3% of all companies, blah, 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 get hacked. We need a rational way to respond to threat because that's the only way that really works. This sort of sensationalist, reactionary, let's just go buy things, let's just run out and do things, let's not think anything through, that just doesn't work. And the problem is that business leadership, if you rope them into kind of that emotionalism, if you rope them into that process, that's not a sustainable thing. They're going to get frustrated because eventually they're going to go, wait a minute, you told me there was this humongous, massive, serious problem with APT. We spent a ton of money on stuff, and it's not really doing anything for us, which is something I hear a lot from customers, I might add. And so you're going to end up in a process where there's going to be this heavy-duty investment in these perceived threats or this perceived risk that may or may not exist. When that doesn't come to fruition, there's going to be a backlash from that of executive management saying, you know what, forget this. You guys, we're tired of just running out and buying gear. We're tired of just responding. We're going to do nothing anymore because it doesn't mean. And that's almost worse because now they're going the other direction and they're rejecting what are legitimate problems. When you can rationally respond to risk, when you can put it in a framework that people can get and they can understand, it's no longer this emotional process. It's no longer this reactionary thing. It's a chart. It's a decision. It's something that intelligent people can sit around a table and say, let's prioritize here. Let's go beyond just checking off boxes on our PCI assessment and really think through what we're trying to do as a business and how this is going to help us.
Yeah, and I agree completely, Andrew. And what I would add to that is that when you have those rational conversations and you become part of the discussion and you bring a risk management perspective to information security, the perception of your organization changes from that of a utility function, that we have to pay our insurance every month, to a business partner that is a true function of the business, a risk management function, and you do end up with a seat at that table. Maybe you're not there every month, but when you're giving presentations to your audit committee and to your board, and you're having relevant, rational conversations about the risk posture of the organization in terms that the business leadership can understand, you change the perception of your organization, and it becomes much more influential at the senior leadership level.
Absolutely. We've hit our end point here, and we want to thank all of you for listening to us today. I want to give everybody the opportunity to ask us some questions about this process, about the technology. Go ahead and use the chat window or the question feature. I've got a window up here, so you can ask your questions through the chat function, and Chris and I will take a shot at answering them. It looks like we got our first one came in right here. So you discussed how we need to move from technical operational information to talking more about the business. How can we begin to facilitate that discussion? That's a good question. Chris, you want to take a shot at that first?
Sure. One of the ways to do that is to begin speaking with the correct language. I like to say that there are 4 buckets that our types of risk need to be placed into: operational risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk, and financial risk. If you can align the information security and IT risks that you're dealing with any of those 4 areas, and hold your conversation about specific things like risks to my brand and my reputation can affect my conduit with my bank with which I pay people, all of a sudden the conversation is extremely more relevant than, hey, there's this bad virus out there and we need new intrusion prevention systems, so we need to spend $150,000. It's a completely different conversation and a much more relevant one to the people that are making the decision and giving you the money.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's very good you mentioned those 4 features, because those are exactly how we organize things in our rapid risk assessment. We talk about those exact things. One of the ones we always like to mention is this idea of relationship risk. What happens when there is a serious problem and a relationship gets broken? And so, it kind of gets back to that hackers analogy in the beginning. Don't go in talking about APT and viruses and whatever we learned. That's the problem we have a lot with, like, the RSA conference and Black Hat and all these security conferences. They really kind of ratchet up the fear language and try to get everybody talking about the latest nit and bit, next generation, this, that, and the other thing. And don't get me wrong, that stuff's interesting. I think that stuff's really fascinating. I could spend all afternoon talking about next-gen firewalls. But the reality is that that's a technical discussion. I can tell you, the business owner, the executive VP, he doesn't care that you have a next-generation anything. That is utterly and totally meaningless to him or her. What he wants to hear is, are we okay? Is everything in good shape? Are we protected? What are those risks? And if you can say to him, look, we've got a challenge here. If we have a serious breach, we're going to, we have the potential of a breach because of these challenges, and this will cause damage to our reputation, or we could really mess up our relationship with a key important partner, or we could get fined. Once you start talking at that level, risk and such, then that's going to grab their interest. What can you do about it? We need to improve these key areas. Okay, how are you going to do that? Well, there's some technologies we need to get out. There's some improvements we need to make. I can get you that, but this is what we need to do. Again, that conversation's now completely different, and it's not going to be whatever. You want to buy another piece of equipment, right? So, okay, so let's move on to our next question here. Here's a good one. What does it take to deploy Allgress rapid risk assessment methodology to a medium-scale company? Well, one of the things that's beautiful about rapid risk assessment, or at Anitian we call it Risk Now. That's our trademarked name. And Allgress is that they really are very scalable solutions. There's really no size. They're not really intended for enterprise. Or it's not necessarily something that the small business simply cannot use. The beauty of rapid risk assessment and its approach and the way it works is that it's good for a small little assessment where you're just looking at maybe an application, and it's good for a gigantic assessment where you're looking at the entire organization. I think Allgress is kind of along the same lines. Even if you're only managing a couple of things, Allgress can very easily synthesize that data, and there's a lot of ways to deploy it and look at it. And I don't know, Chris, did you want to add to that maybe on the Allgress side?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the rapid risk assessment from Anitian, the Risk Now, then brought in and aligned with the Allgress solution gives you the full function where and time to value is very short. From a product point of view, from the Allgress point of view, our time to value is 2 weeks. So if you are producing the data through a rapid risk assessment, and feeding it into Allgress and getting a posture assessment is really a quick function. And to your point, we're built for small, medium, and large. It doesn't matter for us.
Yeah, and I would note one of the things we've done with a lot of our customers is, again, sort of the beauty of risk now, of rapid risk assessment, is that, while we can do maybe your first one, we can also teach you how to do it. We can give you the tools, and Allgress is one of those tools. And then after we've done it and you've got the tool, you can do it yourself. The whole process is about empowering you to do these things so that you don't necessarily need to pay consultants all the time, and that you can have a process that is sustainable. So, okay, we've got another question here. Where do you think the risk conversation is going from an industry point of view? Is NIST widely adapted, or are there other ways to do rapid risk? Ooh, that's a big question. Let me take a shot at that. Risk assessment as a general concept is hotter than hot among the C-suite right now. They're all talking about it. 2-3 years ago, you said risk assessment in the boardroom. Everyone went, isn't that some insurance thing? They all just kind of looked around, whatever. It's becoming a huge conversation. There's a couple of reasons for that. I can give you my opinion as to why I think this is a reason. I think it's that they're talking about it is because they're sick and tired of security. They're sick and tired of IT coming to them going, we want to buy another next generation blah, blah, blah that's going to totally revolutionize. They're tired of vendor pitches. They're tired of being told for the umpteenth, billionth time that this new box of whatever is going to solve everything when it never does. They're just sick and tired of this reactionary sort of approach to security. And they're saying, you know what? We've had it. We're not buying any more gear. We're not going to have another ridiculous initiative and rush off and do something. We need to really know what's going on here. And to do that, we want a risk assessment. We want to really know what our risks are. Now, the regulations that are out there are also propelling that forward. The final HIPAA omnibus has made it clear you got to do a risk assessment, not an option. PCI has always had a part of that. A lot of the financial regulations, the FFIEC has been coming down on financial organizations saying, look, now we're past this whole 2008 financial crisis thing. Yeah, we kind of forgot about risk assessment for a while because we were worried whether you had any money or not. Okay, now that we've purged all the kind of loser banks out of the system, we're going to actually go back to what we talked about a long time ago, which is you need to do risk assessments. So they're coming down. This conversation is everywhere right now. NIST is a great methodology. It's a good universal methodology, but again, it's too complicated. It's a great place to go to get the basics of risk, to get the language, to get that kind of process. But the challenge of NIST, Octave is another methodology, FAIR is more of an accounting-based one, is that they're just too big and too complicated. Rapid risk assessment is a concept, really. It's a concept that we developed at Anitian. We call it Risk Now. All it is we took NIST and simply thinned it down. We found a way to do risk assessments just faster. And the beauty of this is that tools like Allgress came along to help us with this process. When we first started developing rapid risk assessment, there was no tool like this, or the tools that were out there were ridiculously expensive. What Allgress did is say, hey, look at this, and we were like, wow, this is awesome. Not only can we do what we're doing, which is the risk assessment side, but now we have a way to really conceptualize all this in a really graphic and easy to understand way. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question. I don't know, Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think I'm just going to second what you said. And the only thing I'm going to add is that not only are you seeing the changes that Andrew's talking about, and I agree, Dodd-Frank, things like that are really pushing a lot of the risk assessment concept. But not only that, the industry itself is beginning to transition a little, and the CISOs and people responsible for information security and IT risk are beginning to try and change the way they converse with their boards and their senior leadership team. And by leveraging rapid risk assessment and Allgress and bringing that data in a meaningful way, applying context to it, and then being able to have a short conversation that communicates significant information in a relevant way, it truly changes the ability of the organization to meet the new needs, to Andrew's point, of the board's questions about risk and risk assessments and how do we do them and have we done them and what is our posture as an organization, and they can then make a posture and tolerance decision, because that is their role, not ours, and they make it with real information. They've been making it in the past, but they've been doing it without the real data because we haven't been able to give it to them correctly. And these tools, such as the rapid risk assessment, Risk Now from Anitian, and the Allgress tool, give you the ability to facilitate that conversation and have an effective one with your board and your leadership team.
Absolutely. We're coming to the end here. It doesn't look like we have any other questions at this point. If anybody has one, now's your time to ask it. Otherwise, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So a couple of you have asked if we're going to be providing the slide deck to this. The answer to that is absolutely. The slide deck will be available on Anitian's SlideShare website, and Allgress can provide it as well. You're welcome to email us. We could also just send you that link when it becomes available. We've also done a recording of this webinar, which should be available in a few days. We'll get that up on our various websites. Oh, there's the link actually to our slideshow site. I would also note that there's a slide deck on our SlideShare website that is about rapid risk assessment. It goes into a lot more detail about what it is and our sort of what Risk Now is and what the details, the nuts and bolts of that are. And of course, Allgress has some great material on their website as well. I think with that, we'll go ahead and close up then. Chris, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been great. I really appreciate working with you on this. And for all of you who were here today too, thank you very much for being here, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thank you, everyone.